Jesus points out the hypocrisy of doing this in this story, this next story that I want to share. All right, this is in Mark. And it happened that Jesus was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. Okay, so see the scene here. They're walking through this grain field, and they're hungry. And so the disciples are just pulling some grain off, and so that they'll have something to eat. Now, they're not actually stealing, because there was the Jewish law allowed them to do this. But the problem was they were doing it on the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees were saying to Jesus, look, why are your disciples doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Because you're not supposed to harvest grain, right? It's considered to be work. So just the disciples just grabbing some grain so they'll have something to snack on, that is, according to the Pharisees, not lawful on the Sabbath. And here's what Jesus said. Jesus said, have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with him. Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even on the Sabbath. Okay, so the story that he is talking about is from 1 Samuel in the Old Testament. And this is when David, who eventually became King David, but he wasn't King David yet. And he was fleeing from who was the king at the time, King Saul. Okay, and King Saul was trying to kill him. So David was fleeing for his life. And David had a small group of soldiers with him. So during this time, as they were fleeing, they end up going to the tabernacle, the place of worship. And they ask the priest there, whose name was Ahimelech, if he has any bread for them to eat, because it says they were in need. They were hungry. And so they asked the priest, do you have some bread for us to eat? Me and my men are hungry. And the priest says, I don't have any ordinary bread. All I have is holy bread. Okay, now holy bread was bread that had been consecrated for the different services, rituals that they would do for the Lord, okay, in the tabernacle. Okay, and so only the priests were supposed to eat that bread. It was against Jewish religious law for anyone who was not a priest to eat that bread. Okay, so nevertheless, Ahimelech made an exception because he saw that David and his men were in need. And he asked them, he made sure that they had kept themselves pure from women, which they had. And then after he found that out, he gave them the bread so that they could eat that bread. And that was technically against Jewish law. So the point he's making here is that even this man, who we are told was a man after God's own heart, David, when he had a need, he was willing to break the Sabbath rules, when he had this need. And then Jesus says that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So the reason for the Sabbath had always been for people to take time to focus on God, to work on their relationship with God. The main point was for the Israelites to work on their relationship with God. But as usual, the religious leaders had completely missed the point, and they had turned everything backwards, focusing instead on this physical, external behavior, instead of the internal, spiritual reason for the Sabbath. And now in Matthew's version of this same story, Matthew adds a little bit, and he says that Jesus also said this, but I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion rather than sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. So Jesus is saying, first of all, that the disciples are innocent. They are not doing anything wrong by eating these grains. And then what he means here, I desire compassion rather than sacrifice, is that God is wanting compassion. He is wanting relationship, not the physical sacrifice of obeying a bunch of senseless rules.